The wind in Bristle Pass had a way of getting under a person's skin, not just with its grit, but with its loneliness. It was a constant, mournful sound that swept across the plains, carrying whispers from one hardscrabble ranch to the next. For Clara Hensley, it was the sound of her life, for a full year now. Since Sheriff Abel Hensley had been found at the bottom of a ravine with a broken neck and a spooked horse grazing nearby, that wind had been her only steady companion. Her small ranch house sat exposed on a rise of land that baked in the summer and froze in the winter. The paint was peeling, the porch railing was loose, and the fields beyond were a study in brown and brittle gold. Alone, she tended the few cattle Abel had left her, mended the fences he had built, and drew water from a well that seemed to sink lower with every passing day. She was a widow, and in a town like Bristle Pass, that was a brand. She was 26 years old, with hair the color of dark honey and eyes that held the gray of a coming storm. But the town saw only the black dress she wore. Clara kept to herself. She had stopped attending Sunday services at the stark white chapel, where Pastor Miller's wife, Beatrice, would pat her hand with a pity that felt like a judgment. The tight, sympathetic smiles of the other women felt like accusations. They saw her dry eyes and straight spine and called it coldness, a proper widow. They murmured over their sewing circles, would show her grief more plainly. She would weep. She would lean on the church, on the community. But Clara's grief was a private, tangled thing, a knot of sorrow and something else she dared not name, and she could not perform it for them. So the rumors swirled, carried on that same ceaseless wind. Why was a sheriff riding out alone so late at night? He had a new deputy, young and eager. Why had he gone toward the high country without telling anyone? And what of the argument folks said they'd had? Martha Quinn, whose husband ran the general store, swore she'd heard their voices raised as she'd passed their house that evening. A chill in that marriage. She'd cluck to anyone who would listen. A deep chill. Clara knew what they whispered. They looked at her quiet composure and saw a lack of love. They looked at her husband's mysterious end and saw a question she refused to answer. The land itself was unforgiving. The drought had its teeth in the whole territory. And Clara's ranch, small and lacking a proper creek, suffered most. The earth was cracked like old pottery. Her well, a lifeline dug by her father years before Abel, was now more mud than water at the bottom. Each bucket she drew was a labor, the rope groaning, the water cloudy with sediment. Her cattle were thin, their ribs showing like washboards under their hides. In the quiet evenings, by the dim, flickering light of a kerosene lamp, she did not sew or read the Bible. She wrote letters, page after page, in a neat, determined hand, to a lawyer in St. Louis, a man she had never met but who had handled a cousin's estate. "Mr. Abernathy," she wrote, her pen scratching against the paper, "I must again impress upon you the urgency of my situation. The property line markers, as established in the original survey my father commissioned, are being disregarded. The Langford Ranch, which borders my eastern pasture, has moved their fences twice in the last 6 months. They claim the old markers were inaccurate. I have no one here to speak for me, and the current sheriff seems to have little interest in a widow's troubles." She would seal the letters, her heart a tight fist in her chest, and ride the 2 miles into town to post them, feeling the weight of every gaze that followed her down the dusty main street. It was a desperate, lonely battle, and the mail took weeks to travel east and weeks to return. Most often, it did not return at all. It was on one of those parched August afternoons that Cole Maddox arrived in Bristle Pass. He rode in on a dusty bay, not with the swagger of a gunslinger, but with the quiet weariness of a man who had seen too much of the road. He was tall and lean, with broad shoulders that strained the fabric of his worn shirt. A faint, jagged scar cut a white line from his temple down his cheekbone, a permanent mark of some forgotten violence. He did not stop at the saloon for a whiskey or at the hotel for a room. He rode straight through town and out toward the sprawling Langford Ranch. News traveled fast. By the next day, everyone knew that Silas Langford, the wealthiest and most ruthless rancher in the county, had hired a new foreman, and not just any foreman. Cole Maddox, they said, had done time. 3 years in the territorial prison for a crime no one seemed to know the full story of, though plenty were willing to invent one. He was an outlaw, a convict, now put in charge of the biggest cattle operation for 50 miles. The townsfolk watched him with a mixture of fear and fascination. He was a dangerous man, working for a dangerous man. Clara heard the gossip when she went into Quinn's Mercantile for flour and salt. "Hired an ex-con. Can you believe it?" Martha Quinn whispered to another customer, her voice loud enough for Clara to hear. "Langford must be getting desperate? Or maybe he's just looking for a man who won't ask too many questions." Clara paid for her goods without a word, her face a careful mask, and left the store. The news settled in her stomach like a cold stone. Langford was the source of her troubles, the man she wrote about in her letters, the one who was slowly squeezing her off her land, and now he had a man like Cole Maddox to do his bidding. Their first meeting came a week later. Clara was riding the fence line on her oldest mare, checking for brakes. The sun was a hammer in a brass sky. Dust rose from her horse's hooves in a fine, choking cloud. She saw him before he saw her. He was on the other side of the wire, sitting his horse with an easy stillness, his gaze fixed on the horizon as if he were reading something written there. Her heart gave a sharp, unpleasant thump. This was him, the ex-con, Langford's man. She pulled her mare to a halt, her hand resting on the saddle horn. She would not be the one to retreat. This was her land. He must have sensed her presence. He turned his head slowly, his eyes finding hers across the 50 feet of dry grass that separated them. He did not smile or tip his hat in the customary greeting. He just watched her, his expression unreadable. The scar on his cheek was more pronounced in the harsh sunlight. His eyes were a deep, startling blue, like water found in the shade of a canyon. Finally, he nudged his horse forward, stopping just short of the fence. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low and rough, like stones rolling in a riverbed. "This is Hensley property," she replied, her own voice firmer than she felt. "You're riding mighty close to the line." A flicker of something, not amusement, perhaps surprise, passed over his face. "Just getting the lay of the land," he said. "Mr. Langford wants me to know every inch of his—" The emphasis on his was not lost on her. "Some people have a different idea of where that land begins and ends," she said, her chin lifting. He looked from her to the weathered fence posts, then back to her. He did not offer pity or the condescending sympathy she had come to expect from men. He did not look at her as Sheriff Hensley's poor widow. He looked at her as if she were a fence post herself, something to be assessed, a feature of the landscape he was now responsible for. It was unsettling, but in a strange way, it was also a relief. "Reckon they do," he said at last. A simple statement of fact. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, then turned his horse and rode away, parallel to the fence, never once looking back. Clara watched him go, the dust settling behind him. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. He was nothing like the other men in Bristle Pass. There was a hardness in him, yes, but also a directness that was rare. He had not tried to charm her or soothe her or dismiss her. He had simply met her gaze and spoken the truth as he saw it. The encounter did not go unnoticed. A farmhand from a neighboring property had seen them and was happy to spread the tale. By evening, the story was all over town. The widow Hensley, who spoke to no one, had been seen out by the fence line, having a long talk with Langford's new outlaw foreman. What could they have been talking about? The speculation was immediate and ugly. Martha Quinn suggested she was lonely. Others hinted she was desperate, maybe looking for a new protector, even one with a prison record. The scorn that had been simmering for a year now had a new reason to boil over. That night, Clara's sleep was troubled. She dreamed of Abel, not the man she had first married, the steady, smiling deputy who promised to build her a safe and quiet life. She dreamed of the man he had become in that last year, suspicious, angry, his silences heavier than any argument. In the dream, he was standing by the door, his face in shadow, his sheriff's star glinting in the moonlight. "You're a cold woman, Clara," the dream Abel said, his voice echoing with a strange distortion. "You shame me." She woke with a gasp, the phantom words hanging in the silent bedroom. Her cheeks were wet with tears. The nightmares were always the same, a blur of love and fear, of duty and resentment. They always ended with his final night. He had wanted her to go to the town dance, a Founder's Day celebration. He was the sheriff. It was expected. His wife should be on his arm, smiling, making pleasantries with the very people who now whispered about her behind her back. She had refused. The thought of their false smiles and prying eyes was more than she could bear. "It is your duty," he had insisted, his voice tight with anger. He stood over her, his large frame filling the small kitchen, making it feel like a cage. "My duty is to this house, Abel, not to a party." "Your duty is to me," he'd roared, his hand slamming down on the table so hard the lamp jumped. "They're already talking. They say you think you're too good for them, that you're cold. Do you know what that does to a man in my position?" She had just looked at him, her heart a cold, still thing. She had not flinched. "I am tired. Abel, I am not going." He had stared at her for a long moment, his chest heaving, his face a mask of fury and wounded pride. Then he had turned, grabbed his hat and gun belt from the peg by the door, and stormed out into the night without another word. She had watched him saddle his horse in the moonlight and ride out, not toward town, but toward the dark, looming shapes of the mountains. She never saw him alive again. The memory was a raw wound, and the dream left her weeping into her pillow until the first gray light of dawn crept through the window. A few days later, the water dispute became a crisis. Clara was walking back from the small pasture when she saw them, two of Langford's ranch hands, digging a trench with shovels and picks. It ran from a gully on the slope above her property, cutting a deep, ugly scar in the earth. The gully was a dry wash most of the year, but during the rare summer storms, it channeled runoff directly toward the aquifer that fed her well. This new trench was diverting that potential flow, sending it westward onto Langford's own parched fields. It was a deliberate, calculated act of theft, not of cattle or coin, but of water, which was more precious than either. Rage, cold and pure, washed through her. She marched back to the house, saddled her mare with trembling hands, and rode into town. She didn't stop at the mercantile or the post office. She went straight to the sheriff's office and slammed the door open. Sheriff Miller, Abel's former deputy, was a young man with a thin mustache and eyes that always seemed to be looking for a place to rest other than on the person he was speaking to. He looked up from his paperwork, startled. "Mrs. Hensley," he began, rising halfway from his chair. "Sheriff, Silas Langford's men are on my land. They are digging a trench to divert water from my well." The sheriff sat back down, steepling his fingers. He cleared his throat. "Now, Clara, are you sure it's on your land? Property lines out here can be confusing." "I know my property lines. Sheriff, they are stealing my water." "That's a strong accusation," he said, his gaze drifting to a dusty corner of the room. "Silas Langford is a respected man. Perhaps it's a misunderstanding. I'm sure if you just—" "I need you to ride out there with me. I need you to tell them to stop." Her voice was shaking with the effort of keeping it level. He sighed, a long, weary sound. "Mrs. Hensley, I am very busy today. It is a civil matter. In any case, a dispute over water rights. You should speak to a lawyer." "I have been speaking to a lawyer. He's in Missouri. I need the law here." I can't just go accusing a man like Mr. Langford based on your word alone against his. I'll look into it when I have time." He picked up his pen. A clear dismissal. Clara stood there for a moment, the injustice of it burning in her throat. He would not help her. He was either afraid of Langford or he simply did not care about the fate of a difficult widow. She turned and left without another word, the sound of the door closing behind her feeling final. There was only one thing left to do. If the law would not help, she would face the man herself. She rode straight out to the Langford ranch, her mind a storm of angry words. The main house was a grand affair, a 2-story structure of stone and timber that lorded over the valley. She dismounted, her boots sinking into the thick dust of the yard, and marched toward the porch. But it was not Silas Langford who met her. It was Cole Maddox. He stepped out of the large barn, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He saw her and stopped, his expression hardening slightly. "I'm here to see Mr. Langford," she said, her voice clipped. "He's not here. Rode out to the north pasture this morning." "Then I'll speak to you," she said, taking a step closer. "Your men are digging on my land. They are diverting water from my well. You tell them to stop, now." He listened, his blue eyes fixed on her face. The rag in his hand was still. He let her finish, the silence stretching out after her words, amplifying the sound of the wind and her own ragged breathing. "I saw the trench," he said finally. "And you did nothing?" "I follow orders, Mrs. Hensley, same as your husband did." The comparison was a deliberate jab, and it hit its mark. She flinched. "This is not about my husband. This is about what is right." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Right? There ain't much right out here. There's what you can take, and what you can hold on to. Mr. Langford intends to hold on to his water." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in her dusty dress and the defiant set of her jaw. "I'll look into it," he said, his tone flat and non-committal. "But don't you expect fairness. It's a commodity in short supply." He turned and walked back into the barn, leaving her standing alone in the yard, her fury curdling into a familiar, bitter despair. That night, the house felt emptier than ever. The silence pressed in on her. She couldn't eat, couldn't sit still. She lit a lantern and walked out to her barn. It was a small, sturdy structure, filled with the scent of hay and old leather. It was a place of work, but it was also a sanctuary. It was the one place where the whispers of the town and the ghost of her husband could not seem to reach her. She was running a hand over the smooth, worn leather of an old saddle when a shadow fell across the doorway. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Cole Maddox stood there, his hat in his hand. He was just a dark shape against the moonlit sky, but she knew it was him. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said, his voice quiet. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her fear turning to anger. "This is my property." "I know." He took a step inside, into the flickering lantern light. His face was grim. "I came to tell you about the trench. I can't stop the order. Langford wants it done by the end of the week." Her shoulders slumped. "So you came all this way just to tell me I've lost?" "No." He came closer, stopping a few feet from her. "I spent an hour out there after dark. With a shovel, I changed the angle of it some, made it shallower at the turn. It won't stop it, but it'll slow it down. Might buy you another storm's worth of runoff before your well feels the worst of it." She stared at him, stunned into silence. He had gone against his boss, risked his job. For her. Why? "Why would you do that?" she whispered. "Maybe I don't like seeing a man with everything take the last bit from someone with nothing," he said, his voice rough. Then he looked away, as if embarrassed by the admission. "It's not much." "It's more than anyone else has done." The bitterness was back in her voice, sharp and raw. "More than the law, more than the good people of this town. Folks are scared of Langford. he said simply. "And maybe they're a little scared of you, too." "Of me?" The idea was so absurd she almost laughed. "Why would they be scared of me?" "You don't bend," he said, his gaze meeting hers again. It was intense, searching. "You carry your grief like a shield. They don't know what to do with a woman who won't let them save her." His words struck a chord deep inside her, a truth she had never admitted even to herself. The loneliness of the past year, the weight of the scorn, the terror of losing everything, it all rose up in a suffocating wave. She felt a tremor start in her hands. He must have seen it, because he took a half-step forward and hesitantly, gently, reached out and touched her hand. His fingers were rough and calloused, but his touch was surprisingly warm. It was the first kind touch she had felt from another person in a year. Her reaction was violent and immediate. She snatched her hand back as if she'd been burned, a small, choked gasp escaping her lips. The shield he had spoken of slammed back into place, but then, just as quickly, it shattered. The look in his eyes wasn't pity. It was something else. Understanding. A shared loneliness. Before she could think, before she could stop herself. She closed the distance between them, rose up on her toes, and pressed her mouth to his. It was a desperate, clumsy kiss, born of anger and grief and a sudden, overwhelming need to feel something other than pain. His lips were firm, surprised. For a second, he was still, and then his hand came up to cup the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair as he responded. The kiss deepened, and it was like nothing she had ever known. It was not the dutiful, passionless kiss of her husband. It was raw, real, and it sent a jolt of life through her that was terrifying and exhilarating. Just as suddenly as she had started it, she broke it off. She stumbled back, trembling all over, her hand flying to her lips. The air in the barn was thick with their breathing. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and shameful, and began to stream down her cheeks. She looked at him, at the stunned expression on his face, the blue of his eyes dark in the lantern light. "He never kissed me like that," she whispered, the words a ragged, broken confession. And then she turned and fled from the barn, leaving him standing alone in the shadows, the taste of her tears still on his lips. The days that followed were a torment of shame and silence. Clara actively avoided the eastern fence line, sending her cattle to graze in the western pasture where the grass was thinner and the water even more scarce. The memory of the kiss in the barn was a brand on her mind, a hot, searing thing that made her cheeks burn whenever she was alone. It had been an act of madness, a moment of weakness so profound it felt like a betrayal of the very solitude she had so carefully constructed. She had not just kissed a man, she had kissed an outlaw, her enemy's foreman, a stranger, and she had confessed to him a truth about her marriage she had never uttered aloud. "He never kissed me like that." The words echoed in her memory, a testament to a desolate hunger she hadn't known she possessed. She tried to regain her footing by returning to her routines. She sat at the small wooden table in her kitchen, dipped her pen in the inkwell, and attempted to write another letter to Mr. Abernathy in Missouri. Her hand trembled so badly that a large, black blot of ink fell onto the paper, spreading like a spider's web across the half-formed words. She stared at it, this ugly, permanent stain on the clean white page. It was a perfect symbol of what she had done, a mark of her impulsiveness that could not be erased. She crumpled the paper in her fist and threw it into the cold hearth, the letter unwritten. A few days later, her supplies running low, she had no choice but to ride into town. The 2-mile journey felt like 100. She tied her mare in front of Quinn's Mercantile, keeping her eyes down, her bonnet pulled low to shadow her face. The bell above the door chimed, announcing her arrival like a proclamation of guilt. The store was busy. A few women from the church auxiliary were gathered near the fabric bolts, their heads bent together in quiet conversation. As Clara approached the counter, their whispering stopped abruptly. She felt their eyes on her back as she gave her list to Mr. Quinn. While he was in the back room fetching a sack of beans, the pastor's wife, Beatrice Miller, spoke, her voice carrying across the store with the clear, cutting precision of a new knife. "Some people seem to forget their station," she said, not looking at Clara, but ensuring she was heard. "A year is a short time for mourning. A widow ought to carry herself more modestly. I think, especially the sheriff's widow." The other women murmured in agreement. Clara's back went rigid. She did not turn around. She stared straight ahead at a display of canned peaches, her vision blurring. Her hands clenched so tightly her fingernails dug into her palms. Modesty. They spoke of modesty when their own minds were filled with such ugly speculation. She paid Mr. Quinn, gathered her things without meeting his apologetic gaze, and walked out of the store, the bell chiming her retreat. The ride home was a blur of dust and hot, unshed tears. Meanwhile, on the Langford ranch, Cole Maddox was facing his own trial. Silas Langford had summoned him to the main house, to the cavernous office filled with dark wood, leather-bound books he never read, and the mounted head of a large buck with vacant glass eyes. Langford was a big man, running to fat, with a florid face and small, shrewd eyes that missed nothing. He sat behind his massive desk, a decanter of whiskey at his elbow. "Maddox," he began without preamble, pouring himself a drink. "I hear you've been seen talking to the Hensley woman." Cole stood before the desk, his hat held respectfully in his hands, his face impassive. "She had a complaint about the trench." "She always has a complaint," Langford sneered. "That woman is more trouble than a whole season of drought. I want you to stay away from her. You understand me? Don't talk to her. Don't ride near her property unless you have business there. She's poison. Her husband found that out the hard way." Cole did not react. His gaze remained steady, his expression giving nothing away. He remembered the feel of Clara's lips, the desperate, trembling energy that had poured out of her. He remembered the look in her eyes, a mix of fear and defiance that he understood better than Langford ever could. Poison was not the word he would have chosen. Wounded, maybe cornered, but not poison. "Is that all, sir?" Cole asked, his voice even. Langford eyed him, searching for a sign of defiance, but found none in Cole's still demeanor. "Yes, get back to work, and remember what I said." Cole nodded once and left the office, but later that week, against all orders and all good sense, he found himself riding the boundary line again. He told himself it was to check the progress of the trench, to see if his small act of sabotage had made any difference. But he knew it was a lie. He was looking for her. He scanned the horizon, the small, lonely shape of her house, the empty pastures. He did not see her. A part of him was relieved. Another was keenly disappointed. The sky had been a hazy, oppressive white all morning. The air thickened still. By late afternoon, it began to change. Dark, bruised-looking clouds gathered on the western horizon, piling on top of one another with unnatural speed. Clara was out on the range, trying to push her small herd of cattle closer to the meager shelter of a rocky bluff. The animals were skittish, sensing the coming storm. Cole saw the clouds from miles away and knew what they meant. These high-country storms were not gentle summer showers. They were violent, sudden things. He also saw a lone rider far in the distance, a small figure moving against the vast, darkening landscape. He knew it was her. Cursing under his breath, he spurred his horse in her direction. The storm broke with the fury of a physical blow. The sky opened up, and rain came down not in drops but in solid, wind-driven sheets. A crack of thunder exploded directly overhead, so loud the ground seemed to shake. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the world in a series of stark, ghostly flashes. Clara's mare shied violently, nearly unseating her. The cattle scattered, drenched in an instant, her hair plastered to her face. She was blinded by the rain. She heard a shout over the roar of the wind and saw a rider coming toward her through the deluge. It was Cole. "There's an outcrop!" he yelled. pointing toward a dark slash in the side of a nearby hill. "Come on!" There was no time for pride or avoidance. She followed him, leaning low over her horse's neck, the rain stinging her face like needles. They reached the shallow overhang of rock just as another bolt of lightning struck a nearby ridge. The crackle and boom simultaneous. They dismounted, tying their nervous horses to a stunted, gnarled juniper that grew from a crack in the rock. They huddled together in the small, dry space as the storm raged around them, a curtain of water sealing them off from the world. For a long time, they didn't speak. The only sounds were the drumming of the rain and the occasional rumble of thunder. Clara shivered, wrapping her arms around herself, though it was as much from the shock of his presence as from the cold. He stood a few feet away, his hat dripping water onto the dusty ground, his silhouette dark against the storm-lit sky. "You shouldn't have been out this far alone," he said at last, his voice low, almost lost in the noise. "My cattle needed moving," she replied, her own voice tight. "I don't have ranch hands to do it for me." The bitterness in her tone hung in the air between them. Another flash of lightning lit his face, revealing the hard lines around his mouth, the scar stark against his wet skin. "Langford warned me away from you," he said, looking out at the rain. "Then you should have listened to him." "Maybe," he admitted. He turned to face her, his blue eyes searching hers in the gloom. "Why did you do it, Clara? In the barn?" The question was direct, stripped of all pretense, and it left her with nowhere to hide. She looked down at her hands. "I don't know," she whispered, and it was the truth. "I was angry and lonely." He was silent for a moment, absorbing that. "I know what lonely is," he said softly. The sound of the rain was a steady, percussive beat. "Spent 3 years in a cell no bigger than this space. Nothing but 4 stone walls and the sound of other men's misery for company." He spoke of it not with self-pity, but as a simple fact, a piece of his history. "Why?" she found herself asking. "Why were you in prison?" "A man I trusted betrayed me. We were partners on a cattle drive. He altered the books, put the blame on me. By the time I figured it out, the law was already at my door. His word against mine. He was a respectable man. I was not." Lightning flashed again, a long, brilliant flicker. In its light, she saw the weariness in his face, the ghost of a betrayal that had never healed. "I took this job with Langford for one reason," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "I wanted to start over somewhere new, somewhere nobody knew the truth, or what they thought was the truth." His confession opened a crack in her own defenses. He had a past he was running from, just as she did. "People in Bristle Pass think they know the truth about me too," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "They think I was a cold wife. They think I drove my husband to his death." "Did you love him?" The question was gentle, but it pierced her straight through. She thought of Abel, of the good years at the beginning and the hard, silent years at the end. She thought of his anger, his pride, his heavy hand on the table. And she thought of one night, a month before he died, after another argument over something small and meaningless. He had grabbed her arm, his fingers biting into her flesh, and his other hand had flown up, catching her across the cheek. It hadn't been hard enough to leave a lasting mark, but the shock of it had been like a physical blow to her soul. He had looked horrified afterward, had mumbled an apology, but the line had been crossed. "He hit me," she whispered to the storm, the words tasting like poison on her tongue. "Only once, but it changed everything. After that, I couldn't let him near me. Not really." She finally looked up at Cole. His face was a mask of shadows, but she could feel the intensity of his gaze. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't offer platitudes. He just nodded slowly, a deep, quiet understanding passing between them. In that small, storm-tossed space, they were not a widow and an outlaw. They were just 2 people, burdened by secrets. who had finally found someone to tell them to. When the storm finally passed, leaving the air washed clean and smelling of wet earth and sage, they rode back to her ranch in silence. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the glistening land. Her barn stood dark and welcoming. "You're soaked through," she said, her voice hoarse, as they dismounted. "You'll catch a chill. Come inside. I can find a dry shirt." It felt like a momentous invitation. He followed her into the barn, the familiar scent of hay and leather wrapping around them. It was the same space where she had kissed him, but the air was different now, charged with the confessions they had shared. In the dim, fading light, she turned to face him. His shirt was plastered to his chest. His hair was damp, and his eyes had not left her face. The shield she had carried for so long was gone, washed away by the storm. She reached out, her hand hesitating for a moment before her fingers touched his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart through the damp cloth. He drew a sharp breath. His hands came up to rest on her waist, his touch gentle but firm, holding her as if he were afraid she might bolt again. This time, when he lowered his head to kiss her, it was not a surprise. It was an inevitability. The kiss was longer, deeper, and filled with a desperate, aching need that she met with her own. It was a kiss of shared loneliness, of mutual pain, of the stunning, terrifying relief of being seen for who you truly were. When they broke apart, she was breathless, but she did not pull away. She did not flee. Instead, she took his hand, her fingers lacing through his, and led him toward a corner of the barn where loose hay was piled high and soft. There, in the encroaching darkness, hidden from the judging eyes of the world, they found a different kind of shelter. It was not a gentle coming together, but a raw, urgent release. It was the shedding of a year's worth of grief and solitude for her, and a lifetime of regret and isolation for him. It was two broken people, clinging to each other in the dark, trying to piece themselves back together. Clara woke before the dawn. The first pale light of morning was filtering through the cracks in the barn walls. Cole was asleep beside her in the hay, one arm flung over his head, his face relaxed and younger in repose. She watched the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest. Hesitantly, she reached out and brushed her fingers over his scarred knuckles, tracing the hard lines of a life lived on the edges. A wave of tenderness, so fierce and unexpected it stole her breath, washed over her. But just as quickly, shame crept in, cold and insidious. What had she done? She had spent the night with a man who was not her husband, in her own barn, like a common tramp. The whispers of the town, Beatrice Miller's cutting words, they all came rushing back. She slipped away from him, dressed quickly in the semi-darkness, and fled the barn. She saddled her mare and rode not toward the sunrise, but toward the small, fenced-in cemetery on the edge of town. She stood before the simple wooden cross that marked Abel's grave. The ground was still damp from the storm. The shame she had felt in the barn turned into a different, more complicated sorrow here. "I'm sorry, Abel," she whispered to the silent mound of earth, tears finally streaming down her face. "I am so sorry. I wanted to love you. I tried. But you never let me. You pushed me away until there was nothing left." She cried for the man she had married, for the love that had withered and died long before he had, and for the woman she had become, a stranger to herself. Back in town, things were changing. A young deputy, eager to make a name for himself, had been idly poking around the ravine where Abel's body had been found, in the muddy bank of the creek at the bottom, half buried in silt. His boot had struck something hard. He had dug it out, an old, rust-pitted skinning knife. Its wooden handle rotted away. It was likely nothing, just a piece of junk lost years ago. But it was found near the site of the sheriff's death, and that was enough to start the wheels of gossip and suspicion turning once more. When Cole returned to the Langford ranch, he was summoned again to the big house, this time Langford was not just angry. He was cold, his voice like ice. "The new deputy found a knife down in Miller's Ravine," he said, his small eyes boring into coal. "Folks are stirring things up again about Hensley's death. They're starting to look at the widow. The sheriff will be questioning people. I want you to tell me everything she says to you. I want to know what she's planning, who she's talking to. You will report her activities to me." Cole stood still, the demand settling in his gut like a lead weight. Langford was asking him to betray her, to use the intimacy they had shared as a weapon against her. He thought of Clara's whispered confession in the storm, of the vulnerable trust in her eyes in the barn. He could not do it. "No," he said, the words simple and final. Langford's face darkened. "What did you say?" "I said no, I won't do it." "You work for me, Maddox. You'll do as you're told, or you'll be out on your ear before sundown. A man with your record won't find it easy to get another job." Cole met his gaze without flinching. "Then I guess I'll be leaving before sundown." Before he could be fired, he turned and walked out, leaving Langford sputtering in rage behind his desk. Clara was sweeping the porch of her small house when she saw Sheriff Miller riding toward her. A cold dread settled over her. He dismounted, his face grim and official, and did not remove his hat. "Clara," he said, his use of her first name feeling more like an accusation than a familiarity. "I need you to come into town. I have some questions for you about the night of Abel's death." "Questions? It's been a year." "New information has come to light," he said stiffly. "Someone provided an anonymous tip, a suggestion that Abel's fall might not have been an accident." The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. She was led into the small, stuffy office and subjected to a barrage of questions, the sheriff's voice cold and impersonal. Where was she? Exactly. When he left? Did they argue? What about? Did she know of anyone who held a grudge against him? The questions circled and circled, always coming back to her, to the state of her marriage, to the rumors of her coldness. She left the office feeling violated and terrified, the weight of suspicion a physical cloak on her shoulders. When she stepped back out into the harsh sunlight, her eyes blinded for a moment. She saw him. Cole was there, leaning against a hitching post across the street, his horse's reins in his hand. He had been waiting for her. The sight of him, solid and real and there for her, was too much. He pushed off the post and crossed the street in a few long strides, his face etched with concern. He reached her just as her composure finally broke. A choked sob escaped her lips. She stumbled forward, and he caught her, his arms going around her, pulling her against his chest. She buried her face in his shirt, the solid warmth of him the only anchor in her spinning world. "They think I killed him," she whispered, the words muffled against his chest, the confession a death knell. "Oh, God, Cole, they think I killed my husband." He held her on the dusty street, a firm, grounding presence against the spinning chaos of her thoughts. He did not offer empty reassurances or tell her she was being foolish. He just held her, absorbing the tremors of her fear, until the first wave of panic subsided. Gently, he guided her toward her horse, his hand a steady pressure on the small of her back. The ride back to her ranch was silent, a shared journey through a landscape of fear. The setting sun bled purple and orange across the horizon, a beautiful, indifferent backdrop to her terror. Inside the small, sparse kitchen of her house, she finally spoke, the words pouring out of her in a hushed, desperate torrent. He stood by the cold stove, listening without interruption, his face a study in grim concentration. "It was not just the arguments. Cole," she began, her voice a raw whisper. "In those last few months, Abel, he changed. He became a different man. He grew paranoid, suspicious of everyone, of me." She paced the small room, her hands twisting in the fabric of her dress. "He started accusing me of things, of looking at other men in town, of having secret intentions. He would question me for hours about a simple trip to the mercantile. It was as if he were trying to find a betrayal, as if he needed one to exist. She stopped by the window, staring out at the darkening land. He started locking his desk. He would receive letters and burn them in the stove before I could see the postmark. He told me once, during a terrible fight, that he had a mind to sell this ranch out from under me. Said it was his to do with as he pleased, that my father's name on the deed meant nothing. He said he would take me to a city, to St. Louis, where he could keep a better eye on me. Cole's expression hardened, a muscle tightening in his jaw, but he remained silent, letting her purge the poison of the past year. "And there's something else," she said, turning to face him, her eyes wide with a fear she had held in secret for months. "Weeks after the funeral, I was cleaning out his things, in the bottom of his saddlebag, tucked beneath a false leather lining. I found a journal." She went to a small wooden chest in the corner, her movements stiff and uncertain. She lifted the lid and took out a small, leather-bound book, no bigger than a man's hand. The leather was scuffed and worn. She held it out to him. "I've never opened it," she confessed, her voice barely audible. "I was too afraid of what he might have written about me, afraid of what secrets he was keeping. Now I think whatever is in this book is what the sheriff is looking for. A reason, a motive." Cole took the journal from her. It felt heavy in his hands, dense with unspoken words. He looked from the book to her pale, frightened face. "We read it," he said, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "We read it together, right now." There was no other place to go but the barn. It had become their sanctuary, the one place where the world could not touch them. He lit the lantern. Its warm, flickering glow pushing back the shadows and illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. They sat on an old wooden crate, shoulder to shoulder, the journal open on Cole's knee. The pages were brittle, the ink faded in places, the handwriting a tight, angry scrawl that grew more erratic as the pages turned. Cole read aloud in a low, steady voice, a calm anchor in the sea of Abel's troubled mind. The first entries were mundane, notes on cattle prices, reminders about fence repairs, complaints about the drought. But then, the tone began to shift. October 12th, Cole read, "She refuses to see her duty. She has ice in her veins. She looks at me as if I am a stranger. The town talks. I hear them. They see her pride. They see it as a reflection on me." Clara flinched, closing her eyes. It was as if Abel were in the barn with them, his voice full of that familiar, wounded resentment. The entries grew darker. There were mentions of land, of surveys and boundary markers that did not align. The name Langford appeared, at first just in passing, then with increasing frequency, denoted only by a single sharp initial. November 4th, L has moved the markers again. He smiles at me in town and acts as if we are friends. But he is a thief. He thinks because I am the law, I will not see the law being broken. Or perhaps he thinks I can be bought. He does not know me. November 19th, found another discrepancy in the county records. The survey filed by LT's man last spring does not match the original territorial plat. It is clever, a forgery, but a good one. He is stealing land not by inches, but by acres. He is stealing water. Clara's head shot up. "The trench," she breathed. "It was not just about my well. It was part of something bigger." Cole nodded, his finger tracing the spidery script. "It seems so," he continued reading. Abel's paranoia intensified, the entries becoming a tangled web of suspicion directed at Langford and at Clara herself. He wrote of seeing her speaking to a ranch hand, twisting the innocent exchange into a secret rendezvous. He chronicled every perceived slight, every moment of silence from her, as evidence of her betrayal. Then they came to the final entry, dated the day before his death. The handwriting was nearly illegible, the words crammed together as if written in a great hurry. December 5th. He knows I have the proof. I saw it in his eyes today. He is not a man to be cornered, But I am the law. I will not be threatened in my own town. I am riding out to his northern camp tonight. I will confront the one who knows too much. It ends tonight." A heavy silence fell over the barn, broken only by the soft hiss of the lantern. That was it, the last words Abel Hensley ever wrote. He had gone to confront someone who worked for Langford, and had never come back. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "They will use this against me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They will say I was the one he wrote about, that he discovered I was unfaithful and went to confront my lover, that he was angry. They will say I had a motive to want him dead." "It's not what it says, Clara," Cole said, his voice rough. "It does not matter what it says. It matters how they read it. An angry husband, a cold wife, a mysterious death. It is the story they have wanted to believe all along. This journal, it is my death warrant." He closed the book and set it aside, then turned to face her, taking both of her hands in his. "I will not let that happen," he said, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. "We will figure this out." For the next few days, an uneasy quiet settled over the ranch. Cole had not gone back to Langford's, and Langford had not sent for him. He spent his time mending Clara's fences and checking on her cattle, a silent, watchful guardian. Clara felt trapped in a state of suspended fear, waiting for the sheriff to ride up the path again. One evening, as dusk was painting the sky in shades of bruised purple, Cole rode out to check a section of fence near the ravine where Abel had died. He was working, but he was also thinking, trying to piece together the fragments from the journal. The air was cool and still. He was so lost in thought that he did not hear the riders until they were almost upon him. There were 3 of them, their faces covered with bandanas, their hats pulled low. They emerged from a stand of cottonwoods like ghosts, surrounding him before he could even reach for the pistol he had started carrying again. "Maddox," the leader growled, his voice muffled by the cloth. "You've been told to stay away from the Hensley place." Cole's hand froze. He straightened up in the saddle, his eyes moving from one masked face to the next. "This is Hensley land," he said, his voice calm. "I'm working here." "Your work for Langford is done," another man sneered. "And your work for the widow is about to end, too." They spurred their horses forward, dragging him from his saddle. He hit the ground hard. The air knocked from his lungs. He fought back, a lifetime of hard living and prison brawls guiding his fists. He landed a solid punch that sent one of them staggering back, but he was outnumbered. A boot caught him in the ribs, and a fist slammed into his jaw. The world exploded in a flash of white-hot pain. They were on him, their blows raining down with a vicious, impersonal efficiency. Just as suddenly as it began, it was over. He lay on the ground, gasping for breath, the taste of blood and dust in his mouth. The leader stood over him, a dark silhouette against the dying light. "This is your only warning," the man said, his voice a low threat. "Stay away from her, and stay out of things that don't concern you, or next time, we will finish the job." They mounted their horses and galloped away, disappearing back into the shadows they had come from, leaving him broken and bleeding on the ground. It was nearly dark when Clara started to worry. She was in the barn, forking hay for the horses, when she heard the sound of a lone horse approaching, its gait uneven. She stepped outside and saw Cole's bay, wandering toward the barn with its reins dragging. The saddle was empty. A cold, paralyzing fear seized her. Grabbing the lantern, she ran, calling his name, her voice thin and desperate in the vast emptiness of the plains. She followed the horse's tracks back the way it had come, her heart pounding with every step. She found him a half-mile from the house. He was trying to push himself up, his face a swollen, bloody mask in the lantern light. A deep gash was open on his forehead, and his lip was split. "Cole!" she cried, dropping to her knees beside him. He grunted, slumping back against the ground. "Clara," he managed to say, his voice a pained rasp. "Who did this to you?" she asked, her hands hovering over his wounds, afraid to touch him. Langford's men, he breathed, a warning, to stay away from you. Tears of rage and terror streamed down her face. This was her fault. He was hurt because of her, with a strength she did not know she possessed. She managed to get him to his feet, draping his arm over her shoulders, leaning heavily on her. He staggered back to the house, each step an agony for him. She did not take him to the barn. She took him into her home, into the bedroom that had once been hers and Abel's, and helped him onto the bed. For the next hour, she worked with a fierce, focused love. She fetched a basin of warm water and clean cloths and gently began to clean the blood and dirt from his face. He winced as she dabbed at the cut on his forehead, his breathing shallow and ragged. She cleaned his split lip, her touch as gentle as a whisper. She found dark, ugly bruises already forming on his ribs when she helped him out of his torn shirt. As she worked, silent tears fell from her eyes, splashing onto his bruised skin. She wept for his pain, for his courage, and for the terrible realization that he had risked everything for her, a woman who had brought him nothing but trouble. When she had done all she could, she pulled a chair to the bedside and simply sat, watching him in the dim light of a single lamp. His breathing eventually deepened into a fitful sleep. Sometime in the dead of night, he began to murmur, tossing his head on the pillow. "Clara," he whispered, the name a broken, feverish sound. Her heart ached. She leaned down, her hair brushing against his bruised cheek, and pressed her lips to his in a kiss that was all tenderness and sorrow. It was a kiss of gratitude, a kiss of shared pain, a promise. His eyes fluttered open. They were cloudy with pain, but they focused on her. He lifted his hand, the one with the scarred knuckles, and took hers. His grip surprisingly strong. He pulled her gently closer, his gaze holding hers. There were no words. There did not need to be. Their second night together was not born of frantic desperation, but of a slower, deeper current. It was a confirmation of the bond forged in the storm and solidified by violence. It was filled with an aching need to find comfort, to feel alive, to affirm that in a world determined to tear them apart, they had found each other. It was a tender, desperate act of healing. In the quiet aftermath, they lay tangled together under the quilt, the lamplight casting a soft golden glow on the room. Clara lay with her head on his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. "No one," she said, her voice soft in the stillness, "has ever looked at me like I was worth saving." He was quiet for a long moment, his hand stroking her hair. "I tried to save someone once," he said, his voice low and full of an old, deep pain. "My younger brother, Jacob, he was just a kid, always getting into trouble. I was supposed to be looking out for him, but I was wild myself, running with the wrong crowd. When I got sent to prison, there was no one left to keep him on the straight path." He paused, and she felt a tremor run through him. "He fell in with some bad men, got killed during a botched robbery. He was 19 years old. I got the letter in my cell. I failed him." She lifted her head to look at him, seeing in his eyes not just the reflection of the lamp, but the reflection of a grief he had carried alone for years. She understood now the source of his quiet intensity, the weary sadness that clung to him. He was not just a man running from his past. He was a man trying to outrun his own sense of failure. The next morning, the official word came. One of Langford's men rode up to the house, a sneer on his face when he saw Clara on the porch. He did not dismount. "Langford sent me to fetch Maddox's things," the man said loudly. "He's fired. Langford says he can't trust a man who spends his time stirring up ghosts." It was a public declaration, meant for her to hear, meant for the whole town to know. Cole was cast out. When Cole emerged from the house, his face still swollen and discolored, she did not hesitate. "You can stay here," she said, her voice clear and strong. "The barn is empty. You can have it for as long as you need. It was a scandalous offer, and they both knew it. An unmarried widow, already under suspicion, giving shelter to a fired, ex-con ranch hand. The town's whispers would become a roar, but she did not care. He had stood by her. She would stand by him. The town's reaction was swift and cruel. That Sunday, against her better judgment, Clara felt a pull to go to church, a desperate need for a moment of peace. It was a mistake. Pastor Miller stood at the pulpit, his gaze sweeping over the congregation and lingering on her. His sermon was on the sins of the flesh, on the temptations that prey on the lonely, and on widows who forget their sacred duty to their departed husbands. Every word was a veiled accusation, a stone cast directly at her. Halfway through, Clara could bear it no more. She stood up, her back straight, and walked out of the church, the sudden silence and the weight of every eye on her back more damning than any sermon. While Clara was facing her public trial, Cole, still bruised and moving stiffly, made his way into town. He did not go to the saloon or the sheriff's office. He went to the blacksmith's forge at the edge of town, a place of heat and soot and the rhythmic clang of a hammer on steel. The blacksmith, a burly man with a stump for a left hand and a kind, weary face, was named Stumpy Callahan. He and Cole had known each other in the territorial prison. Callahan looked up from the horseshoe he was shaping, his eyes widening in concern when he saw Cole's battered face. "Maddox," he said, setting down his hammer. "Looks like you've been reacquainted with the less pleasant side of life." "You could say that," Cole said, leaning against a support beam. They spoke for a while in low tones, catching up on the years. Then Cole steered the conversation. "Stumpy, you hear things. You know people. What do you know about Abel Hensley?" Callahan spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "The old sheriff? A proud man. A bit stiff, but honest. Too honest for his own good. Maybe—" He picked up a piece of metal with his tongs, his eyes on his work. "He came in here a few times, near the end, asking quiet questions. Not about horses." "What kind of questions?" Cole pressed. The blacksmith looked around, then lowered his voice. About land deeds, about surveyor's marks. He had a suspicion that Silas Langford wasn't just buying up land. He thought he was creating it. On paper, at least. Falsifying deeds, moving boundaries, claiming creek beds that weren't his. Hensley was getting close to proving it. I reckon. A dangerous thing to get close to. The whispers that had once been a persistent annoyance now became a tightening noose around Clara's life. Sheriff Miller, emboldened by the anonymous tip and the discovery of the knife, began to build his case with a grim, methodical diligence. He questioned her again, this time in her own home, his presence a violation of her sanctuary. His questions were sharper, more pointed, circling the argument she'd had with Abel on his final night. He was not alone. He brought with him Jacob Abernathy, a neighbor from a nearby homestead, a quiet man who had always been civil to Clara. Abernathy stood twisting his hat in his hands, his eyes fixed on the floor, as the sheriff prompted him to speak. "Tell Mrs. Hensley what you told me. Jacob." The man swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he mumbled. "But he asked me what I saw. I was checking on a stray calf that night, the night he passed. I cut across the high pasture. I saw the lights on in your house. I heard voices, raised voices, a man and a woman, arguing something fierce. Each word was a nail in her coffin." Clara stood by the hearth, her hands clasped before her, feeling the blood drain from her face. It was true. They had argued. But Abernathy's simple testimony, stripped of all context, painted a damning picture of a volatile, hateful marriage. After they left, the silence in the house was heavy and suffocating. The town was no longer just whispering. It was bearing witness against her. 2 days later, the next blow fell. A man on a fine horse, a clerk from the county seat in Willow Creek, delivered an official-looking document. It was a formal notice, filled with cold, legal language. Her property boundaries were being challenged in a territorial court. A petition had been filed by Mr. Silas Langford, citing irregularities in the original survey. A hearing was scheduled. She had 30 days to respond. She read the document 3 times, but the meaning was clear from the first. He was going to take her land. The fence moving, the water trench, those had just been the opening skirmishes. This was the final assault. She sank into a chair at her kitchen table, the paper trembling in her hand. She was facing the loss of everything: her reputation, her freedom, and now, her home, the last piece of her father's legacy, the only thing she had left in the world. Cole found her there, sitting in the fading light. The notice spread on the table before her. He read it over her shoulder, his breath a low hiss as he took in the words. "He is not going to win," Cole said, his voice a low growl. "How can he not?" Clara asked, her own voice hollow and defeated. "He has money, he has power, and he has the whole town convinced I am a black-hearted murderess. Who is going to stand for me?" "I will," he said simply, "and we will." The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, they rode out together. It was a long, dusty ride to the county seat, a larger, more established town than Bristle Pass. The county records office was a stuffy, cramped room in the back of the courthouse, presided over by a balding clerk with ink-stained fingers and an air of profound indifference. Cole did the talking, his voice calm and firm, requesting to see the plat maps and deed filings for the Hensley property and the adjacent Langford Ranch. Going back 20 years? The clerk, annoyed at the extensive request, grudgingly began pulling out heavy, bound ledgers and rolled maps. 4 hours. They hunched over a large table, the air thick with the smell of old paper and dust. They compared her father's original, hand-drawn survey, which she had brought with her, to the official copies in the books. At first, everything seemed to be in order. Then, Cole found it. A new deed, filed just 6 months before Abel's death. It redrew the eastern boundary line, ceding a significant portion of Clara's pasture and, more importantly, the rights to the runoff from the gully, to the Langford Ranch. "Here," Cole said, his finger jabbing at the page. "Look at the signature." It was purported to be her father's, from years earlier. But when they compared it to the signature on her original deed, the differences were subtle but undeniable. The loop of the H was tighter, the cross of that set at a slightly different angle. The ink was a shade darker, fresher. It was a forgery, a brilliant, almost perfect forgery. "He planned this all along," Clara whispered, a sick feeling rising in her stomach. "Abel must have found this. This is what he was talking about in his journal. This is what he was going to confront Langford about." It all clicked into place. Langford's land grab, Abel's investigation, and his subsequent death. He had not died in a drunken fall. He had been silenced. And now, Langford, seeing Clara and Cole digging into his affairs, was using the law and the town's prejudice to finish the job, to erase her and any claim she had. The system was not just stacked against her. It was being actively wielded as a weapon. She felt a wave of utter hopelessness wash over her. What good was the truth when the lies were written into the official record? The ride back was grim. The setting sun seemed to mock them, bathing the land Langford was stealing in a beautiful, golden light. When they reached the ranch, Clara slid from her saddle, her body aching with exhaustion and despair. She walked straight to the barn, the one place she had always felt safe, but even it felt tainted now, a part of the prize Langford was about to claim. Cole followed her in. She stood in the middle of the dusty floor, her back to him, her shoulders slumped. "It is over," she said, her voice flat. "There is nothing we can do." "We are not done fighting. Clara!" She spun around to face him, her eyes flashing with a sudden, wild anger born of grief and terror. "Fighting? With what? A ghost's journal and a forged signature that no one will believe? Before you came, it was just whispers and loneliness. I could bear that, but you stirred it all up. You made me hope. You made me fight back. And now look, I'm about to lose everything. They will take my land and they will hang me for a crime I did not commit. You have brought ruin upon me. Cole Maddox. She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving, her fists clenched at her sides. He just stood there, his face a mask of sorrow, and took it. He did not defend himself, did not argue. He let her rage, her fear, her pain wash over him. He accepted the blame, because he understood it was not truly meant for him. It was meant for the world, for a fate that had been cruel and relentless. Her anger shattered as quickly as it had erupted, and she collapsed inward, a wave of gut-wrenching sobs shaking her entire body. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders heaving. He was there in 2 long strides, pulling her into his arms, holding her tightly as she wept. He did not pat her back or whisper soothing lies. He just held her, a solid, unmoving anchor in her storm. When her sobs began to subside, he tilted her chin up, his thumbs gently wiping the tears from her cheeks. He looked into her eyes, and his face was filled with a fierce, desperate intensity. Then he kissed her. It was not gentle. It was a hard, possessive kiss, a kiss that demanded she feel something other than despair. It was the kiss of a man trying to pour his own strength into her, trying to anchor her in place and keep her from being swept away. For a moment, she was stiff with shock, but then she responded, her hands coming up to grip his shirt, her own desperation meeting his. She kissed him back with all the fear and fury and fight she had left in her. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathless, she rested her forehead against his chest. "Even if I lose everything," she whispered, her voice ragged, "do not let me lose this." He held her tighter. "Never," he vowed. That night, they did not go back to the house. They climbed the ladder to the hayloft, and in the quiet, hay-scented darkness, they curled together under an old horse blanket, seeking not passion, but solace. They held each other through the long, dark hours, 2 survivors adrift on a hostile sea, clinging to the only raft they had. In the days that followed, while a fragile peace settled over the ranch, Cole made a decision. He bought a single sheet of paper and an envelope from town and, in the barn, by lantern light, he carefully composed a letter. His handwriting was slow and deliberate, the writing of a man not accustomed to the task. He wrote to a man named Emmett Shaw, a retired U.S. Marshal he had known years ago, a legend who was known for his tenacity and his intolerance for the kind of corruption that festered in places like Bristle Pass. He told Shaw everything he knew and suspected about Silas Langford, about Abel Hensley's death, and about the forged deeds. He posted it in a town 10 miles away, hoping it would not be noticed. It was a long shot, a desperate prayer sent out into the wilderness. A week later, a stranger arrived in Bristle Pass. She came on the afternoon stagecoach, a woman in her late 40s dressed in severe, well-made black. She had a face carved from grief and granite, with eyes that had seen too much and held no illusions. She took a room at the hotel and began making quiet inquiries. Her name was Eleanor Vance, and she was the widow of a rancher from the next county over, a man named Thomas Vance, who had died a 1.5 years ago after being thrown from his horse. A tragic accident. Everyone had said, a horse that had never spooked before. Her husband, she explained to a few curious townspeople, had been involved in a land dispute with his neighbor at the time, a man named Silas Langford. The next day, she hired a buggy and drove out to Clara's ranch. Clara saw her coming up the long, dusty track, and her heart sank, assuming it was another official from the county, another harbinger of doom. But the woman who stepped down from the buggy had a different air about her. "Mrs. Hensley?" she asked, her voice calm and strong. "My name is Eleanor Vance. I believe we have a common enemy." Clara led her inside, and for the next hour, She listened as Mrs. Vance told a story hauntingly similar to her own. A story of a proud, honest husband who had discovered evidence of Langford's land fraud. A story of intimidation, of veiled threats, and of a sudden, convenient death that the law was too quick to label an accident. Thomas was like your husband, Mrs. Vance said, her hands folded primly in her lap. He wrote letters. He was building a case to present to the territorial governor after he died. The letters he had sent to various officials were returned to me, unopened, with polite notes of condolence. She opened a large leather satchel she had brought with her and took out a thick sheaf of papers. I also found these copies of letters your husband sent. It seems he and my Thomas were in correspondence in the weeks before his death. They were planning to expose Langford together. She slid a small stack of envelopes across the table. They were addressed in Abel's hand. Clara stared at them, her heart pounding, his voice reaching out from the grave. She and Cole and Mrs. Vance read them together. The letters were damning. They laid out Abel's suspicions, his evidence of the forged deeds, and his growing fear of Langford. They were a clear and undeniable record of his investigation. He had not been a paranoid, jealous husband spiraling into madness. He had been a lawman on the trail of a dangerous criminal, and he had been murdered for it. The sense of vindication was overwhelming, but it was quickly followed by a cold dread. They now held the proof that could destroy Langford, and Langford knew it. That night, the attack came. Clara was asleep in the house, Cole in the barn, when the smell of smoke jolted her awake. She sat bolt upright, her heart hammering in her chest. A terrifying orange light was flickering against her bedroom window. She ran to it and looked out. The barn was on fire. Flames were already licking up the dry timber walls, reaching for the night sky. "Cole!" she screamed, throwing on a robe and running barefoot out of the house. The heat was intense, the air thick with smoke that burned her lungs. The two horses and the old milk cow were trapped inside, their terrified whinnies and bellows a horrifying chorus. Just as she reached the yard, the main barn doors were thrown open from the inside, and Cole emerged, silhouetted against the inferno. He was choking, his face black with soot, but he had the panicked horses by their lead ropes, dragging them out into the yard. He shoved the ropes into her hands. "Get them clear!" he yelled over the roar of the flames, then turned to go back in. "No!" she shrieked, grabbing his arm. "Cole, do not go back. It is too late." "The cow is still in there," he shouted, pulling his arm free. "And the saddles? And Abel's journal?" Before she could stop him, he plunged back into the blazing barn. A moment later, a section of the roof collapsed with a deafening crash, sending a shower of sparks and burning embers into the sky. Clara screamed his name, her voice raw with terror. It felt like an eternity, but it was probably only seconds later that he stumbled out again, half carrying, half dragging the singed and terrified cow. He shoved the animal toward safety and then fell to his knees in the dirt, gasping for air, his shirt smoldering. She ran to him, beating out the small flames on his back with her bare hands. He was alive, but he was badly burned. The sleeves of his shirt were gone, his arms raw and blistered. His back, where a burning beam must have grazed him, was a landscape of horrific injury. With a strength fueled by love and adrenaline, she helped him into the house, into her bed, the same bed where she had tended his bruises. The smell of smoke and burned flesh filled the room. This time, the injuries were not just bruises to be soothed. They were angry, weeping wounds that spoke of his impossible courage. She worked through the rest of the night, her mind numb with shock, her heart filled with a fierce, protective love that burned brighter than any fire. She cleaned the burns as best she could with cool water and covered them with clean linen torn from her own bed sheets. Her land was scorched, her barn a smoking ruin, her name forever tarnished in the town. She had lost almost everything, but as she looked at the man lying in her bed, The man who had charged into a burning building to save her animals and the last remnants of her husband's legacy. She knew that her feelings for him were now absolute, unshakable. Toward dawn, he stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He tried to speak, but his voice was a dry, painful croak. She leaned down, pressing a cool, damp cloth to his forehead, smoothing his soot-stained hair back from his face. He looked at her, his eyes full of pain, but also something else, a deep, unwavering trust. She leaned down further and kissed his lips, a kiss so gentle it was barely a touch, a kiss full of all the words she could not say. "I have never loved anyone this way," she whispered, the tears she had held back all night finally falling onto his face. And in that moment, she knew it was the truest thing she had ever said. The pain from Cole's burns was a constant, living thing in the small house. The air grew thick with the scent of calendula salve and clean linen. Clara worked tirelessly, her exhaustion a distant hum beneath a sharp, focused determination. She learned the geography of his injuries, the angry red flesh on his arms, the terrible landscape of his back. She moved with a gentle, practiced efficiency, changing his bandages, bringing him water, sitting by his bedside while he drifted in and out of a feverish sleep. In those quiet hours, she watched the man who had walked through fire for her, and the love she had confessed in a moment of terror took root, deep and unshakable, in the scorched soil of her life. Cole, for his part, endured the pain with a stoicism that broke her heart. He never complained, but she could see the effort in the tight clenching of his jaw, the sweat that beaded on his brow. His recovery was slow, but with every day that passed, a little more strength returned to him. By the time a week had gone by, he was able to sit up in a chair on the porch, his back carefully propped with pillows, his bandaged arms resting in his lap. He had saved Abel's journal from the fire, tucking it inside his shirt before he'd gone back for the cow. It was smoke-stained and warped from the heat, but its words remained. That, along with the letters from Eleanor Vance, was all the ammunition they had. The day of the hearing at the Territorial Land Council dawned bright and clear. The journey to Willow Creek was an ordeal. Every jolt of the wagon sent a fresh wave of pain through Cole, but he sat straight and silent beside her, his face set like stone. Eleanor Vance met them at the courthouse, a pillar of grim, black-clad support. The council chamber was an imposing room of dark wood and tall windows, designed to make a person feel small and insignificant. 3 men, gray-haired and stern-faced, sat behind a long, polished table like judges at a final reckoning. Langford was there, seated with his lawyer, looking confident and respectable in a fine wool suit. He gave Clara a dismissive glance, and Cole a look of pure, venomous hatred. Clara spoke first. Her voice, though quiet, did not tremble. She laid out the story, presenting Abel's smoke-damaged journal and the letters he had written to Thomas Vance. She spoke of the forged deed, of the escalating intimidation, of the fire that had destroyed her barn and nearly killed the man beside her. When she finished, Eleanor Vance spoke, her testimony corroborating every detail, painting a picture of Langford's long history of predatory greed. Finally, Cole was asked to speak. He did not rise. He simply turned in his chair to face the councilmen, letting them see the extent of his injuries. The raw, red skin of his arms, visible beneath his rolled-up sleeves, was a more powerful testimony than any words. "Silas Langford did this," Cole said, his voice low and raspy. "He sent his men to beat me, and when that did not work, he sent them to burn a woman out of her home. These are not the actions of a man with a legitimate claim. These are the actions of a thief and a coward." Langford's lawyer was on his feet immediately, objecting, calling Cole a known felon whose word was worthless. The lead councilman, a man with a weary, cynical face, held up a hand for silence. He looked from the damning letters to Langford's indignant face, then to Clara's desperate hope. He sighed, a man caught between a powerful local rancher and a politically inconvenient truth. "The evidence presented is compelling," he said, his tone non-committal. "However, it is largely circumstantial. We will need time to investigate these serious allegations. The boundary ruling is hereby delayed pending further review." It was not a victory, but it was not a complete defeat. It was a reprieve. As they left the courthouse, Langford brushed past them, a cold, triumphant smirk on his face. He had not lost, he had only been delayed, and time was a weapon he knew how to use. The confrontation came 2 days later, in the heart of Bristle Pass. Clara had needed to purchase more medical supplies, and Cole, though still in pain, had refused to let her go alone. They were walking out of the mercantile when 3 of Langford's men blocked their path. They were the same men who had attacked Cole before. He recognized them instantly. "Leaving town, Maddox?" the leader sneered, stepping forward. "Langford thinks it's time you and the widow moved on. Permanently." People on the street stopped to watch, their faces a mixture of fear and curiosity. This was happening in broad daylight, a raw display of power. "Get out of our way," Cole said, positioning himself slightly in front of Clara. "Or what?" the man taunted. "You'll fight us. You can barely stand." He shoved Cole hard. It was a mistake. The smoldering rage Cole had been nursing for weeks erupted. He did not stagger back. He met the shove with a surge of motion, his fist connecting with the man's jaw in a solid crack of bone on bone. The man went down in a heap. The other 2, stunned for a second, charged forward. Cole met them head-on. It was not a brawler's clumsy fight. It was the desperate, efficient violence of a man protecting everything he held dear. He moved with a pained stiffness, but also with a cold fury. He took a punch to the ribs that made him grunt in agony, but he delivered a blow to the second man's stomach that doubled him over, gasping for air. The whole street was a theater of violence. Before the third man could act, Sheriff Miller and his deputy came running, drawn by the commotion. They did not see the instigation. They saw Cole Maddox, the ex-convict, standing over 2 of Langford's men, his fists raised. "That's enough, Maddox," the sheriff yelled, drawing his pistol. "You are under arrest for brawling and disturbing the peace." Cole slowly lowered his hands, his chest heaving, his eyes blazing. They put him in irons and led him away, leaving Clara standing alone on the street, the town silent, judging eyes all upon her. Langford had won. He had removed her protector and painted him as a violent criminal, all in one swift, public stroke. The jail was a single, squalid cell at the back of the sheriff's office. Cole sat on the hard, narrow cot, the pain in his burns and his ribs a dull, throbbing fire. But it was nothing compared to the ache in his soul. He had let his anger get the best of him, and in doing so, he had played right into Langford's hands. He had left Clara alone and vulnerable. The sheriff gave him a stub of a pencil and a single sheet of paper, and in the dim, dusty light filtering through the small, barred window, Cole wrote. He wrote of his regret, of his failure to protect her. He wrote of his past, of the shadow of his brother's death and the years he had spent believing he was not worth saving. "Clara," he wrote, his words clumsy but painfully honest, "I am sorry. I let my temper get the best of me and I failed you. For years, I have believed I bring nothing but trouble to the people I care for. It is a hard thing to live with. You are the first person who has ever looked at me and not seen the scars first. No one has ever needed me without fear. To be needed by you is the only thing that has ever made me feel clean. I do not know how this will end, but I need you to know that whatever I have done, it was for you, always for you." He gave the letter to the deputy, who, with a look of pity, delivered it to Clara. She read it in her kitchen, the words blurring through her tears. The letter was a window into his soul, a raw and beautiful confession that strengthened her resolve into tempered steel. She took the letter, along with Abel's warped journal, and marched back to the sheriff's office. She did not ask or plead. She walked in and slapped the journal down on Sheriff Miller's desk with a sharp crack. Read it, Sheriff, she said, her voice shaking with a cold fury. Read what my husband wrote in the days before he was murdered. Read about Silas Langford's forgeries and the man he was going to confront. Abel was your friend. He was your sheriff. And you have let his killer walk free while you persecute his wife. The sheriff stared at the journal, then at her blazing eyes. For the first time, a flicker of doubt, of shame, crossed his face. Now read this, she said, placing Cole's letter beside the journal. Read the words of the man you have locked in your cell. Tell me if that is a man who starts a brawl for no reason, or if that is a man who is pushed into a fight while protecting the woman he loves. Sheriff Miller picked up the journal. He began to read. Clara stood and waited, her silence more powerful than any shout. He read Abel's suspicions, his discovery, his plan for a confrontation. His face grew pale. Then he read Cole's letter, his expression shifting from suspicion to a reluctant understanding. The pieces were all there. The proud, honest lawman and the ex-convict with a core of decency, both pitted against the same ruthless enemy. The official story, the one Langford had so carefully crafted, was beginning to unravel. I will look into this, he said, his voice quiet, finally meeting her gaze. Seriously. That night, Clara walked back to the jail alone. The town was dark and quiet. The deputy on duty let her approach the cell. Cole was lying on the cot, but he sat up when he saw her. He came to the bars, his face a mess of shadows and moonlight. She reached her hand through the cold iron bars, and he took it, his fingers wrapping around hers. Thank you for the letter, she whispered. She leaned forward, pressing her face against the bars, and kissed him. It was an awkward, impossible kiss, a meeting of lips through a cage of iron, but it was the most intimate kiss of her life. He never kissed me like that, she said, her voice thick with emotion as she pulled back, her fingers still laced with his. She looked into his eyes. And I know why now. It was because I never let him know me. I hid behind my duties, and he hid behind his pride. We were strangers living in the same house. But you see me, a judge from the county seat, summoned by a telegram from the sheriff. Arrived 2 days later. After reviewing the evidence and hearing the sheriff's newfound concerns, he ordered Cole's immediate release, ruling that he had acted in self-defense. Cole walked out of the jail, a free man, into the bright morning sunlight where Clara was waiting for him. The tide was beginning to turn. Clara's land hearing was rescheduled, and this time, the news was not met with scornful whispers, but with a growing murmur of support. That week, at a town meeting held to discuss a new bridge, Clara stood up, in front of the entire town, in front of the pastor's wife and the women who had scorned her. She told her story. She did not speak of murder or forgeries. She spoke of her husband's honor, of his fight to protect the people of their community from a powerful man's greed. She spoke of her own struggle to keep her home, and of the good man who had stood by her when no one else would. When she sat down, the hall was silent. Then, a woman in the back, the blacksmith's wife, began to clap. Slowly, hesitantly, others joined in. It was not a roar of applause, but it was a beginning, a shift in the wind. The next afternoon, as she was surveying the blackened ruins of her barn, a young girl, the daughter of the neighbor who had testified against her, approached timidly. Without a word, the girl placed a single, bright yellow wildflower on the scorched foundation, then turned and ran away. Clara picked up the flower, a small, fragile symbol of hope, and for the first time in a long time, she smiled. Cole, meanwhile, had taken the few dollars he had left and ridden to a neighboring town. He returned that evening leading a horse. On it was a new saddle, beautifully tooled, the leather smelling rich and new. "The fire took yours," he said, his voice gruff, avoiding her eyes. "A woman needs a good saddle." She looked at the saddle, then at him, at his earnest, bruised face, and she knew this gift had cost him everything he had. She began to weep, not with sorrow, but with a profound, overwhelming love. They were no longer alone. The following Saturday, Stumpy Callahan, the blacksmith, rumbled up the track in his wagon, a load of fresh-cut timber in the back. Jacob Abernathy, the neighbor, followed, his own wagon filled with tools, his face a mask of quiet apology. A few other men who had respected Abel and were tired of living under Langford's thumb, came with them. Together, under the vast blue sky, they began to rebuild the barn. The sound of hammers and saws filled the air, a rhythmic, purposeful music. It was the sound of a community healing, of a future being built, nail by nail, board by board. The new barn rose from the ashes, its raw, pale timber a stark testament to both loss and resilience. The scent of fresh sawn pine mingled with the lingering smell of soot, a fragrance of new beginnings layered over old sorrows. With every swing of a hammer, a piece of the past was buried and a beam of the future was raised. Bristle Pass watched, and for the first time, it watched with a quiet, burgeoning respect. The day of the final hearing was different. There was a tension in the air, but it was the tension of a rope pulled taut, ready to snap. When Clara and Cole rode into Willow Creek, with Eleanor Vance following in a hired buggy, they were not alone. Stumpy Callahan, the blacksmith, had closed his forge for the day and followed them, his face set in a look of grim determination. A few other familiar faces from town were there, too, standing at the back of the council chamber, their presence a silent, powerful statement. The room was the same, but the atmosphere had changed. The three councilmen looked less weary and more alert. Sheriff Miller sat near the front, no longer a reluctant official but an officer of the law, his gaze fixed on Silas Langford. Langford still sat with his lawyer, but the confident smirk was gone, replaced by a rigid, almost brittle composure. Eleanor Vance was the first to testify. She was the picture of dignified grief, her voice clear and steady as she recounted the story of her husband's death, presenting the returned letters from Abel Hensley as proof of their shared investigation. She spoke of Langford's methods, of his pattern of intimidation and legal manipulation. She was not a hysterical widow. She was a meticulous archivist of her own tragedy, and her testimony laid a foundation of cold, hard fact. Next came Stumpy Callahan. He stood before the council, his one good hand resting on the railing, and spoke in the plain, honest language of a working man. He told them of Sheriff Hensley's visits to his forge, of his quiet questions about land deeds and surveyors. He was an honest man, Stumpy said, his voice ringing with conviction. And he was worried. He told me he believed a great injustice was being done to the small ranchers in this territory. He said a man's property is all he has, and to steal it on paper is the same as stealing it with a gun. He was not a man to let an injustice stand. Then it was Cole's turn. He walked to the front of the room, the scars on his arms a visible map of the violence that had brought them all here. He did not speak of his past, of his time in prison. He spoke only of what he had seen and what he had endured. He described the ambush, the beating, the arson that had nearly claimed his life. He held up Abel's smoke-stained journal. "This book," he said, his voice low and powerful, "is the reason Abel Hensley is dead, and it is the reason my back and arms are scarred." Silas Langford tried to burn the truth. He tried to beat it into silence, but the truth is a stubborn thing. He looked directly at Langford, his blue eyes like chips of ice. An honest man has nothing to fear from the truth. Finally, Clara was called. She walked to the stand, her black dress a symbol not of mourning, but of quiet strength. She felt the eyes of the entire room on her, but for the first time, she was not afraid. She placed her hands on the railing and looked directly at the lid councilman. She did not raise her voice. She did not weep. She simply told her story. She spoke of the encroaching fences, the stolen water, the threats. She confirmed the details in Abel's journal. not as a cold wife cataloging her husband's paranoia, but as a partner finally understanding the true nature of the burden he had carried. She held up the forged deed, placing it beside her father's original copy, letting the documents speak for themselves. "My husband was a good man," she said, her voice clear and resonant in the silent room. "He was a proud man, and at times, a difficult man. But he was, above all, a man of the law. He died because he would not stand by and watch that law be twisted to serve one man's greed. He died defending his office, and he died defending the homes of his neighbors. People like Mrs. Vance, and people like me. To suggest he died for any other reason is to dishonor his memory and to betray the very community he gave his life to protect." She finished, and a profound silence held the room. The lead councilman looked at the mountain of evidence before him. The letters, the journal, the 2 deeds. He looked at the faces of the witnesses, the grieving widow, the honest blacksmith, the scarred survivor. Then he looked at Silas Langford, whose face was now pale with sweat, his composure finally cracking. The verdict, when it came, was swift and absolute. The council found unanimously in Clara's favor, declaring the forged deed null and void and restoring her original property lines without question. The councilman then turned his attention to Langford. Based on the considerable evidence of forgery, intimidation, arson, and a conspiracy that likely led to the death of a respected officer of the law, he announced, his voice like thunder. "This council recommends that the territorial prosecutor issue a warrant for the immediate arrest of Mr. Silas Langford." Chaos erupted. Langford lunged to his feet, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. But Sheriff Miller was already moving, his hand on his pistol. In the confusion, Langford shoved his own lawyer aside and made a desperate bolt for a side door. He was gone before anyone could stop him. But there was nowhere left for him to run. He fled town on his fastest horse, a man stripped of his power, his reputation in ashes. A posse, led by a grimly determined Sheriff Miller, rode out after him. 3 days later, news reached Bristle Pass. Silas Langford had been captured by a U.S. Marshals patrol just miles from the New Mexico border. He was in federal custody, and he would face a federal judge. The town, in its eagerness to absolve itself, wanted to hold a celebration in Clara's honor. Pastor Miller's wife approached her after the next Sunday service, her face arranged in a look of profound sympathy, and suggested a town picnic to celebrate her vindication. Clara looked at the woman who had publicly shamed her, at the faces of the people who had so easily believed the worst, and she felt not anger, but a great, weary distance. "Thank you, Beatrice," she said, her voice polite but firm. "But that will not be necessary. I did not survive for a medal, I survived to live." She turned and walked away, leaving the town to its guilt and its relief. She had no interest in their party. The only celebration she needed was the quiet peace of her own land and the presence of the man who stood waiting for her by the gate. A few days later, when the dust had settled and the rhythms of life were beginning to feel normal again, Cole asked her to ride with him. They left the ranch behind, heading up into the rolling foothills that rose toward the great silent peaks of the mountains. The air grew cooler, cleaner, scented with pine and the rich smell of the high country. They rode for an hour in a comfortable silence, simply enjoying the feeling of being free and alone, away from the prying eyes of the town. Finally, Cole pulled his horse to a halt on a high meadow. Below them, the valley stretched out, a patchwork of brown and gold. A small, clear creek tumbled over smooth stones at the edge of the meadow, and a stand of tall aspen trees shivered in the breeze, their leaves like golden coins. "This is it," Cole said, his voice quiet with a kind of reverence. He dismounted and stood looking out over the land. "This is what?" Clara asked, sliding down from her saddle to stand beside him. "The place," he said, a faint, shy smile touching his lips. "When I was in prison, I used to close my eyes and picture a place, A piece of land where a man could build a life, where the water was clean and the view was long. A place to be at peace. This was always the place I saw. He looked at her, his vulnerability a raw and open thing. I used to dream of owning it one day, of starting over, with nothing but what I could build with my own 2 hands. Clara looked at the meadow, at the life-giving creek, at the sturdy aspen trees. She looked at the vast, open sky and the distant mountains. It was a place of impossible beauty and profound peace. It was a place for a new beginning. She turned to him, her heart so full it felt like it might break. "Let us build it together," she said softly. "Something that is ours from the start." The winter was long and quiet, a time of healing. They lived in her small house, 2 solitary people learning the gentle art of companionship. With the spring came the thaw, and the land, which had been so hard and unforgiving, softened. The grasses greened, and the creek on Cole's land swelled with melted snow. One bright April morning, Clara knelt in the soft earth beside the new, unpainted barn. With her bare hands, she dug a small patch of ground and planted the first flowers. Tiny, violet shoots she had carefully transplanted from a sheltered spot by her own creek. As she pressed the dark, rich soil around their roots, she felt a sense of peace settle over her that was deeper than any she had ever known. She was not just planting flowers. She was planting a future. That night, they took a blanket out into the yard and lay side by side, looking up at the vast, star-dusted canopy of the sky. A full moon bathed the valley in a soft, silvery light, and the new barn stood as a pale, hopeful silhouette against the darkness. The air was cool and still. The only sound the distant, lonely howl of coyotes, a wild music that was no longer frightening, but was simply the sound of their world. Clara turned her head on the blanket to look at him. His face, illuminated by the moonlight, was calm. The lines of pain and weariness softened. The scar on his cheek was just a silver thread. He turned to meet her gaze, his blue eyes deep and full of a quiet, steady love. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. Tears welled in her eyes, not of sorrow or of grief, but of a gratitude so profound it felt like a prayer. She leaned in and kissed him slowly, a kiss that held all the trials they had endured, all the peace they had found, and all the hope of the years to come. Her tears wet her lips, and he tasted their salt. When she pulled back, she whispered the final, deepest truth of her heart. "You are the only man I have ever let touch my heart." He gathered her into his arms, pulling the blanket around them both, and they held each other, wrapped in a warmth that defied the cool night air, in a trust that had been forged in fire and fear. They lay there for a long time, 2 survivors who had found not just solace, but a home in each other. The story closes with the image of them in the morning sun, riding out from the ranch, not away from a past that haunted them, but toward a future they would build together. They rode toward the high meadow, toward the tumbling creek and the aspen trees, toward the mountains, their silhouettes merging with the vast, wild landscape. Survivors of grief, bonded by truth, and bound by a love that had dared to grow where nothing else would. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire. We encourage you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow fans. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.